Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will cover the life, literary works, and particularly the letters of Seneca. We all know about this famed Stoic philosopher and member of the imperial court, and we're going to learn a great deal more about him with our guide for this next side quest, Dr. Liz Gloyn. Now, just as a heads up, this episode will cover some discussion of suicide as it was in the ancient world compared to how suicide is discussed and viewed and thought of today. If there's anybody who has had past experiences with friends, loved ones, or whomever, listening to this episode, please keep that in mind as we get to it. I just wanted to alert you to that before the episode begins. Dr. Liz Gloyn, how are you?
I am fine, thank you. Lovely to be here, Ben.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Taking time out of your day to be here on, let's see, it is a Thursday, 4 o'clock my time. You're a little bit ahead. So I appreciate you being available.
No, it's lovely to make time to chat.
Well, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get into the field that we refer to as the classics?
Yeah, so I was very lucky in that I went to a secondary school. So that is sort of from what, 11 up, where we had the chance to take Latin from year 8, which is sort of 12. And I leapt at the chance and I loved it. I just absolutely loved it. And the our education system works a little bit differently in that when we get to the end of sixth form before going to college, going off to university, we decide a degree straight away rather than going in and then deciding your major in your first couple of years. And I decided that actually what I wanted to do was to do my BA in classics. Because I had the Latin, I had the language, I loved the culture, I loved what I'd read, and this was what I wanted to do. So I um, went and did that for 3 years to Cambridge, and then I did a master's degree there, and then I was lucky enough to be able to come to the States to do my PhD work. So I did my PhD at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. And yeah, it's just sometimes these people just find their place and they're just there. It's been very much like that with me in the discipline. Yeah, there's always just been something a little bit more to say and a little bit more to do and a little bit more to find out. And yeah, I've been very lucky that it's all fallen into place.
How was adjusting to Jersey?
It was an experience in a good way because obviously you sort of turn up somewhere and I mean an English accent goes miles. Everyone is terribly understanding if you just sort of stand there and look slightly baffled in English. Everyone is suddenly very kind, very understanding. But it was a really good experience. So I lived in Jersey for 3 years, in New Brunswick, and then I lived in New York for 3 years, while I was actually doing the writing and think working putting stuff together. And yeah, it was a really great experience. And I'm very, very grateful I had the chance to do it.
Well, young people who are listening to this, if there are such people, I don't know, I don't track any metrics, but if you do get a chance to study Latin, do it. We did at my junior high school, which
Mm.
is grades 7 through 9. And I said, well, I'm never going to use that. I don't have any need to do it. And now in my 30s and 40s, I am reading lots of classical either history books or translations of primary sources. And I'm reading a book now and looking at some of the translation notes. And I was like, oh, those are cases and things of grammar that I don't understand. Lovely. So great,
Yeah, we had loads of people in our program who that have since gone on to go and do high school teaching work, and I mean it's wonderful. It's wonderful to see that there are these opportunities for people to have this language in and pick it up and have exposure to it, which is yeah, so important.
And I think it's particularly important, and we'll discuss a little bit about this later. When you're reading someone's translation, you will inevitably stumble across a phrase and you say, there is no way that is what was meant. So I read that in one of Graves's translations of Suetonius, and I was
Oh,
like, Oh, that's a turn of a phrase about an emperor.
That
Gotta
was a
look that one up.
choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now I was thinking to myself, it would be great if I actually knew how to read Latin, but I don't. Oh well. My
Uh,
loss. May someone else learn from my mistake.
hey, it's never too late to go and pick it up, is what I will say to anybody who isn't a young person listening to this podcast. There are always opportunities to and online courses and all sorts of things for picking these things up. So
And I
time,
can't.
however.
Right. Exactly. And I can't say it was a mistake because I ended up taking German, and that's how I met my wife. So
There we are.
hence now my kids are dependent upon that choice. So I can't quite class it as a mistake. But be that as it may, can you tell us where you are working currently and what kind of courses and subjects you teach?
Yeah, sure. I teach at Royal Holloway, which is part of the Federated University of London, and we're based just in Surrey, outside of London. Um, I'm not going to start explaining that structure right now because it's arcane and bizarre, but it's fine. And I specialize teaching in Latin language and literature courses. I teach, so we have courses for people who come to us with no Latin and indeed no Greek whatsoever. And we have courses for people who've been able to do A level like I was and, come in. So we make sure people can do languages if they want to do languages at every single level there with us, which is really, really important. Just because you didn't go to the right school doesn't mean you don't get to do Latin, um, or indeed Greek. So this past semester, I have been teaching a module on Latin epic. So that was a sort of an advanced language course, and we were translating Statius's Achilleid, which is a fantastic poem, which is about Achilles when it was meant to be all of Achilles' life story, but the poet Statius died before he finished it, which is sad. But we do get the first book and a half, which means we get the episode where Thetis is so worried about Achilles being killed in the Trojan War, she hides him on the island of Skyros in drag as one of the princesses in Lycomedes' palace, which is where we get the hero Pyrrhus turning up from later, saying, "Hi, Achilles is my dad." Which is a brilliant poem to read with people who think that all you get in Latin is sort of nice togas and organized things because it's fantastic. And I also teach on a module called Contemporary Approaches to Latin Literature, which is all about using new and theoretical approaches to get new things out. It's amazing what you can get out of a text that's 2,000 years old. There's always a new perspective and always a new way of understanding something. And that's getting our third year students, so our finalists, our seniors, to really think about what they bring to the texts. What is their one special thing that they're going to unlock from this text if they sort of put their minds to it. And that's a really exciting module because people start out going, "Oh, I can't do this," and then they're writing amazing coursework by the end of it as they've sort of grown intellectually and worked things through. So that's a delight.
And what's interesting is you as you read those, I read the Aeneid, and I think close to halfway through the Iliad right now. You really
Mm.
learn how nothing ever changes, which is kind of
Oh yeah.
sad. Um,
Mm.
kind of sad.
Nothing.
People are violent and brutal, and they get all worked up over pride, and people have to perish.
People, nothing new under the sun. Human nature really hasn't changed. And I get that a lot with students where they're reading things and like, but this was in the news last week, or this happened in my life, or whatever. And you're like, yeah, yeah, it did. um, I so on the one hand, the ancient world feels very close, and on the other hand, you run into things where you're like, no, they were very different. They were that no, we don't think about no. So there's always that tension about sort of seeing the recognizable and at the same time sort of going, the past is also another country. You're always negotiating those two things.
Right. And it's funny. Part of the reason I wanted to reach out to you about this, and I was
Mm,
glad that you responded. Uh, and this ties into Nothing Ever Changes. I've slowly, and I don't know if I'll ever get to do this, but I've been working on a presentation for, I'm an attorney for our continuing legal education now. We have to
mm.
do these stupid "Are we okay?" legal wellness courses. Like practicing law can be sad, and we want you to feel good because like it's our trauma, he said sarcastically. It's not our trauma, it's our clients, and but anyway, so I was sitting through this legal wellness thing, and I was getting really annoyed. And I just said, look, all this about how to deal with things is already in Marcus Aurelius's letters and it's in Seneca's letters. Why is somebody, making these sort of mindfulness courses things? We can just read these other texts. And I was getting really annoyed by it, which was probably counterproductive to
Mhm.
the concept of Stoicism and the practice of law. But that's what led me to reach out to you actually.
Mm.
And so let's talk about that a little bit because we're going to discuss Seneca. And we've all, I'm sure, heard of his letters or have read them. But you're in fact working on a new edition of that, aren't you?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I am currently working with Penguin. So they have an edition of Seneca's letters that has just been as is since it was first published, which is back in the 60s. And the introduction to that hasn't changed in the last, I was about to say 40 years. It's more than 40 years, she says, showing her age. But anyway, it hasn't been done since it was published. And you read back through it now, and it's very it's not, let's put it this way. If I were if I were thinking of one of my undergraduates picking up this volume and thinking, I'm going to read the introduction, and the introduction is going to help me understand what Seneca was getting at, and they read what's currently in there, they would feel even more at sea by the time they got to the end of it. So I've written a new introduction, which is outlining what is going on in this collection, because it's not all of the letters, it's a selection of the letters. I don't think we know how the letters were chosen. I think the original compiler who did the translation and wrote the introduction, I think he made the choice of the letters according to what he felt like, which is fine. You've always got to make some selection principles, but we don't know what those selection principles were. And he made the choices. He wrote the introduction. It's just been sitting there. So this is my attempt to guide people through what's going on, what are the themes from this collection, what are the big ideas that you want to engage with. And I've also done some new notes, because obviously things in the phrasing or whatever that clearly the original translator thought, oh no, everybody know what that is. It's like, no, they might have done in the 1960s. They probably didn't in the 1960s. But
Right.
we'll add a new note in there, or we'll revise this note, or whatever. So that is now with Penguin, and I'm waiting for the copy editing team to get back to me with proofs. So hopefully, some point this year, the new edition with my new introduction should be coming out, which is really exciting.
And so the
Um,
version that you're updating was translated by Robin Alexander, is that right?
Yeah, so the edition was originally put together by Robin Campbell, and he had a really fascinating career, including quite a long stint in the British Army doing various things in colonial outposts, and then decided to do this edition, which just goes to show that publishing in the 1960s was a different world. Um, but as I say, the collection he put together still has, and the letters themselves still have so much to say and so much that's useful. So giving it an updated intro and some fresh notes to make it more accessible for people who are picking. The translation is great. The translation is absolutely fine. It's just that extra contextual material for people coming to this text for the first time, maybe not having had a chance to do a classical civ module, not done anything at high school, not done anything at university, but wanting to know a little bit more. So I'm really pleased that there's going to be that extra support for people coming to the letters.
Well, that's great, and we'll be looking forward to that. But why don't we tell the audience who Seneca was? What just 30,000 foot overview of Seneca? How would you boil it down for a presentation?
Seneca is born kind of around 0 BC, but we don't quite know when. He was born into a really elite Roman family who had their roots in Spain originally, in Cordoba. His father, however, was really big on the Roman legal scene. You will find sometimes, if you're looking around the internet, things attributed to Seneca the Elder. That's his dad. And he wrote loads and loads, as it happens, of legal casebook material, which was all about, practice cases and stuff you would say in cases and what would be a good angle to do in these hypothetical legal scenarios, which normally involve pirates. They're ridiculous. They're absolutely ridiculous. They're worth a look. You would love them. So his dad was really big in Rome, so the entire family transplanted to Rome at the same time as sort of maintaining their sort of agricultural fields and properties out in Spain. So the young Seneca grew up in the middle of Rome, in the middle of the intellectual life, with a dad who was sort of very much into sort of this shared academic rhetorical scene. And he, because of being part of this senatorial class, the class of senators, the politician class, who also happened to be very wealthy, he
A
was
good
sort of,
gig.
yeah, nice work if you can get it.
Right.
He was brought into the imperial circle, so he got sort of close to the Emperor Caligula. When the Emperor Caligula came to the throne, Caligula is basically known. He's the one who said that his horse would make as good a consul as the person who was actually a consul, um, which was being rude.
Or maybe.
It could also have been a truthful comment upon the consul's
Right.
actual abilities, but um, so he was really close to the imperial family, and so close that it was actually convincing enough for him to be exiled by the Emperor Claudius. So Caligula's after Caligula was there's a lot of death of emperors in this. Caligula was assassinated. Claudius, the next emperor, then exiled Seneca on a charge of adultery with one of Caligula's sisters. So there was kind of an assumption they must have been close enough for that to at least hold enough water not to look too weird. I tell my undergraduates this, and they're like, "Seneca did adultery." It's like, well, yes,
It was
strangely
the
enough.
style at the time.
Well, he was a young man at that point. It's he didn't sort of spring to life as a sort of 60-year-old philosopher with a beard. Um, so he was sent off into exile on a tiny island. And eventually, Claudius also died. And Claudius is sorry, beg pardon. Claudius did not die. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I made an error there. So he's sent off into exile on a tiny island. And eventually, the wife of Claudius, who had got him to exile Seneca, herself ended up dying because she had done adultery. It gets all very complicated. And his next wife said, "Right, I want Seneca back because he's really smart, he's really good, he will be a brilliant tutor for my son, and he will also therefore be in my debt." And this was, of course, Agrippina, who is the mother of the boy who will go on to be the Emperor Nero. So that's how Seneca finds himself in the middle of the imperial family. He's the tutor to Nero, and what a surprise! Claudius ends up dying as well.
Right. So you said you made a mistake earlier, but he did die. I
He
mean,
did. He did die. I just got his death in the wrong point. So when Claudius dies, Nero is then the tutor of the young boy, young man. He's sort of in his teens at that point, who suddenly is then emperor, leader, ruler of the Roman state. Um, Deeply indebted to Agrippina, who got him off for exile, and basically attempting to make sure that things don't fall over with a teenage boy who's suddenly been told he's in charge of everything.
let me just
What could
say,
possibly go wrong?
yeah, my son has just recently gotten his driver's license, and teaching him to drive a vehicle with a manual transmission has been challenging enough. I couldn't imagine them giving him the keys to an empire like Rome. But anyway,
I do say to my classes, just look around you and imagine the boys in this class as being emperor and the looks of horror that go over everybody's faces.
uh,
It's
yeah, I mean, I get it, and yeah, so he's in Nero's orbit, and there was some rumor that maybe he was skimming off the top some funds, commission perhaps being tipped, a gratuity.
well,
Tip
there's
culture is
always
big these days in the States, so was there
yeah,
any truth to
there's
that?
I not that I think there is particularly. I mean, he gets more of a reputation for being well, fabulously wealthy, but also being really what's the right word? Exploitative. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, has an absolutely fabulous rumor. I mean, and it is a rumor. Cassius does not like Seneca at one little bit. That one of the reasons that the war in Britain gets going is because Seneca ends up lending money to one of the Britons who doesn't want the money but lends him this extortionate amount, and then calls the loan back in and essentially risks bankrupting the province of Britain, which is this is the level of money that's meant to be knocking around. But whether or not this is actually true, Dio is our only source for it, and Dio is very not impressed with Seneca just generally. So that's kind of where it comes from. But he is living obviously at the peak of imperial wealth. He's living in this charmed circle around the emperor. He's got access to all sorts of favors, and you're probably right, people probably do try and bribe him now, whether just because that's how you gain access to the emperor, and especially when you're dealing with a teenage boy and you know who his tutor is and you know whose job it is to mark his homework. I mean, it's not a big thing. But bribery in that sense is not a Roman concern. They don't have the concept of bribery and that idea, but certainly in terms of being in a situation where that kind of see, the Romans were much more open about it. They talked about it as a patronage society, which is that you would do favors for somebody and they would do favors back to you. And ultimately, the emperor is the biggest patron of the lot. So you want the emperor to be your patron, but obviously having somebody like Seneca would also be jolly good. So
Yeah. So, hmm. Going back to things not changing, your patronage system and favors and bribes and skimming off the top has weirdly no parallels to current American society after the Supreme Court's Trump immunity opinion. And I'm just going to leave it at that. It's a Thursday. I'm just going to leave it at that. I will
It's
let
only
people.
Thursday.
It's a
Yeah.
yeah.
I think
It's
I think the one thing I will
mm.
say is that one thing that the Roman system had going for it was there were very clear rules and expectations about how this stuff worked. Seneca wrote he wrote a volume called On Benefits, which is all about how you exchange these beneficia, these benefits between people, and the rules for following them, and how you get it wrong, and how not to be really crass about it, and how to do it in a way that's really like socially productive and good. In and how you sort of show appropriate gratitude and how you show appropriate benevolence, because it goes both ways. It's not like just you hand upwards and whatever. So there were expectations about how this stuff worked, and it was ingrained and it was embedded, and everybody had access to it and knew what the rules were, as opposed to, hypothetically speaking, systems which are closed and internal and it's not a socially embedded norm in that sense.
So, and also something that has no contemporary parallels to modern day, as Seneca was close to the orbit of power. He suffered a falling out and then died, and had some problems crop up. And again, that never happens. People near the center of absolute power never ever have situations where they get kicked to the curb. So it's kind of weird how that happened.
But this is sort of a bit more extreme, and I have to be really clear with my students about this. Content note, we're going to have a quick chat about suicide, but it's not suicide as you might be normally thinking about it. So what happened to Seneca was that so obviously we had a teenage boy who was okay with having some guys. So Seneca um, and the Praetorian prefect, whose name was Burrus, they both kind of took over guardianship roles when Nero was a teen, and that was fine. And then as Nero got older and he wanted to do more stuff and do the fast chariot racing and the drinking and the partying and the
Normal teenage, yeah.
normal teen, and the slaughtering of his political enemies and all that kind of stuff. I mean,
Hey, you get
what
tired,
teenager has not wanted to slaughter their political enemies?
right?
You sort of gets to a point where essentially he has had enough of these people trying to hold him back and tell him what to do, and he wants just to be able to have the absolute power. And Seneca kind of makes a good decision. Burris dies of natural causes, and we think it's basically throat cancer that gets Burris from the descriptions.
Hmm.
And yeah, it really seems to actually be a physical problem for Burris. So that's sort of very definitely natural causes. Nobody accuses anybody of poisoning him, which, believe me, in the Roman historians is really rare. Um, you get Seneca, who manages to sort of retire from public life and say, I'm going to go and do philosophy. I'm going to go and do leisure. I'm not, and he there are Tacitus gives sort of a number of occasions where Seneca tries to go, look, I'm retiring, and Nero says, no, you're not retiring. You're not retiring. No, I'm retiring. I really am. So Seneca demonstrates self-preservation in trying to get out of this and be able to focus on his philosophy rather than be caught up in what is very much a knives out kind of situation in the court. Um, Unfortunately, uh, Seneca's brother then gets involved, and possibly Seneca's nephew then get involved in an assassination plot against Nero, which is uncovered. And the assumption is basically, if your brother and your nephew were doing this, you kind of knew this was going on. So what happens as a result is that Seneca is ordered to commit what I call political suicide. So it's really important to be clear that this is my students hear me say this and they're like, what? How? What? Um, in the Roman state, the senatorial class, even though they are essentially doing what the emperor tells them, still have some dignity. So it's not like an execution. It's not like I don't know, the guillotine in France, which is a completely different scenario, but it's
Right.
not kind of that thing. So what they do is they say, okay, we have found we've decided that you're guilty for being involved in this plot. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a choice. The emperor is now going to invite you to die by suicide. And if you haven't done that by tomorrow morning, then some nice men from the Praetorian Guard will be around with a large sword. And they'll take it from there. So it's essentially, and in order to retain some control and some dignity over the situation, there's kind of sort of like a 24 hours grace to do the decent thing. And when I say the decent thing, I mean the thing the emperor has decided is the decent thing, regardless of anything else. Because, now some people in that situation basically leg it and go into exile in another end of the empire. Um, but during Nero's period, most people kind of at the point then they realise that the chips are down, are sort of in the point where the nice man with the large sword is standing outside the door going, hi, whenever they look outside. And it's like, the running
Right.
away thing is not going to do so much well here. So they end up doing essentially as they're told and dying by suicide because they've been ordered to, which is really important to be clear that that's not, when we have conversations around suicide awareness today, obviously that's often in the context of mental health. This is completely different.
Right.
This is something completely elsewhere.
Yeah, I kind of think of it in my mind like how Cato committed suicide when Caesar had won, and it was apparent that Caesar had won. And also, in for people who have seen the Rome TV series, when Mark Antony tells Lucius Vorenus, "Why haven't you done your duty since you failed?" It was just viewed very differently, and I could see where people today have a hard time understanding how it was viewed differently and what was involved with it. And so uh, I I hope people get that as we're talking about it. But you play around with fire, sometimes you get burned, and
Yeah,
that
and it's not as if this was not a well-known um if you read through sort of Tacitus's account of Nero's reign, I mean the number of people who die in this way, who are forced into this situation, I mean they're everywhere. I mean Nero did this a lot. So yeah, it's part of a pattern. It's part of a definite pattern of um particularly Nero being really well, having a lot of assassination plots that he uncovers, which is often the cause for this kind of thing, for people being in this situation.
Yeah, well, it came back to bite him eventually. So we know of Seneca, a lot of us, as a Stoic philosopher of some sort. Can you define that term for us, and then address whether he should be considered as a Stoic?
Yeah, absolutely. The Stoicism itself as a school of philosophy dates back to the fourth century BC, came out of Athens, where lots and lots of different philosophical schools sort of emerged. And they were originally called the Stoics after the Polike Stoa, which is Greek for the painted colonnade. And they were called that because that's where they hung out. And that's where they started forming these ideas, and they got it together, and they were named after the place that they met rather than any one important thinker. If you compare that, for instance, to the Epicureans, who are another philosophical school who are emerging at this time, they're named after Epicurus, who is like their main thinker, their big thinker. But the Stoics are um, sort of known for being these guys in this place instead. And that's kind of really important because what the Stoics are all about is about thinking for yourself. Like there are some shared concepts, and we work stuff out together, and we bang ideas around. It's not about following what our founder said and following their word. It's about we've got these principles and we're going to kind of explore what they mean together. Um, so somebody who sort of is part of that intellectual conversation and adheres to the core tenets and is in discussion with that, and calls themselves a Stoic, is the person who would be a Stoic. Now, Seneca very definitely calls himself a Stoic. However, there was a bit of a period during the 19th century and sort of large parts of the 20th century where people didn't think he really was. They called him an eclectic philosopher, sort of somebody who picked up lots and bits and bobs from everywhere. But that is mainly, I think, because what his writings show is this mind who's interested in what other people have to say and in responding to it and being in dialogue with it and like taking the good bits out. When you read the letters, there's loads and loads of quotes from Epicurus, which is one of the reasons people said this kind of stuff. Well, he wouldn't have quoted Epicurus if he was a Stoic. But one of the points Seneca makes is that actually a lot of these good ideas that Epicurus says kind of jive with stuff that the Stoic school was saying as well, and that wisdom is not one school's prerogative, and that you can therefore grab wisdom wherever you can. And he sort of says some stuff that Epicurus says, and then disagrees with it, and sort of explains what the Stoic position would be. And it's part of that rich intellectual conversation. But people found that quite difficult because they wanted it neat. And Seneca is he's somebody who's engaged in that conversation and that debate. And if you're looking for it for a neatness and a almost an exclusivity, it's like, well, I won't consider those ideas. I will only do my own school. It's like, well, no, of course you're going to start thinking he's not what he is. So people invented an entire separate category of thinker in order to explain why this guy was paying attention to other schools. And you're like, no.
That
But
yeah, that reminds me of the ongoing debate in niche music circles about what is punk rock music and what defines
mhm.
punk rock, and pretty much only the only thing you gain from that is what people don't think is punk itself. It sounds very similar to a lot of those discussions, but the idea that you would say, I guess it's an example of people not understanding, or needing, maybe is a better way to phrase it, needing to understand the pros and benefits of interdisciplinary communication.
Yeah, and interschool philosophical communication. It's about that whole. It's worth remembering that for the Romans, philosophy is not like we might think of it today. People in university departments thinking about the trolley problem or whatever. It's a way of how you live, right? It's a way of how the principles that guide the way you live and the underlying understanding of how the world is put together that take you in that place, take you to that place. And of course, you're going to talk to people doing doing philosophy differently in order to kind of road test your own ideas and trash theirs. And I mean that dialogue, of course, that's going to be there. But Seneca says he's a Stoic. Seneca says his ideas are from Stoicism. Um, he is our best written evidence for what the Roman Stoics of this period are thinking and how that all works. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, he is definitely a Stoic.
Well, kind of get into maybe how his philosophy developed. Do we know, was it the result of formal education? Was it trial and error thing that he picked up from observation? Did it just kind of like, me, for example, I just in my 30s started developing an interest in Roman history. Did he just come on philosophy late in life and was interested in it? Or later in life? God, I hope it's not late in life for me.
He did have it was part of his formal education. So as a young man, he had the standard Roman rhetorical education, which starts with doing your alphabet when you're a kid, and moves up into being taught how to do law cases, because that's kind of what young men of the political class go and do. They go and become lawyers. So he goes off and gets that kind of training. But it was also very common for people to go off and have, say, a year in Athens or whatever, to be like ancient Roman finishing school. To sort of go off and be polished off with some philosophy to kind of make you intellectually competent. So he didn't land on Stoicism to start with, interestingly enough. He sort of seems to have flitted around different philosophical schools that were active in Rome, because there were bunches of people belonging to these different schools available. And so when he was a teenager, young man, he spent a lot of time, and refers to in some of the letters to the Sextii, who were sort of Platonists of one form or another. He also hung out with the Pythagorean teacher, Sotion, and Sotion was sort of so influential on him that he briefly became a vegetarian. One of the Pythagorean things was you shouldn't eat living people, because what would happen if you ate your great-great-grandfather who'd been reincarnated as a cow?
That's his problem.
Seneca stopped being a vegetarian and says, on the one hand, it was partly because my father was worried I would be caught up in this purge that Tiberius was undertaking, and on the other hand, I just liked meat.
Well,
So,
I mean, don't come back as a cow. That's not my fault.
um, but he eventually found a group of Stoics who were exploring what Stoicism meant in Rome, and that will be sort of part of that late teens, early 20s intellectual development. He sort of found that was his intellectual home, as it were, and he continued to engage with those ideas all the way through his life. So, I mean, remember that you've got thinkers and speakers, and Rome is a really big popular speech culture. So just as we might go to a gig today or something like that, they'd go to hear somebody speak, go and listen to this philosopher speak about whatever, or indeed literally read their latest poem or whatever, as part of this kind of performance culture. So you could just go and listen to somebody visiting, talk about whatever it was they're going to talk about for an hour, or go and hang out with them, or meet them at somebody's home, or there was a whole much more verbal sharing ideas culture going on there that Seneca would have been absolutely embedded in.
It sounds like the French cafes during the Enlightenment.
Kind of so, yeah. Those,
Oh,
but
without coffee.
without coffee, no. More watered wine.
Well, that works too. You can never go wrong with if you've got a good glass of wine with you.
Mhm.
So the letters that we have, how did those come about? Do we have a good understanding of how he ended up writing those?
Yeah. So they are written at the end of, they're the last thing he writes. They're his last published work. And they look like, on the surface, a collection of like genuine letters. They have somebody they're written to. He's called Lucilius. We know that Lucilius is a guy who is in Seneca's life. He's an equestrian, which is like the level below senatorial, so like better than the plebs, but not quite being in that same political power rank. Two other things that Seneca writes are also addressed to him, so he's there. But what this collection doesn't have, which is really unusual compared to other ancient letter collections, is it doesn't have any of Lucilius's responses. You can kind of assume, sometimes he says, now, you said in your last letter, Lucilius, and then goes on to answer whatever the question was or respond to it. But it's not actually a living letter collection in the sense that you can trace the to and fro from Lucilius. So what the consensus now is that these letters are sort of a fictional correspondence. right? They're written as if they're letters to Lucilius, to this one guy who has perhaps unwisely said to Seneca, "Do you know, Seneca, I really fancy knowing some more about Stoicism. Could you possibly talk to me about this?" Because Lucilius is painted as this guy who's trying to get into the Stoic life, who's trying to adapt his own ways and his own approaches, and he's sort of writing to Seneca as a somebody who's been doing it for a bit longer and is a bit of a mentor. And Seneca is very clear, saying, we are people walking along this pathway together. I've been walking longer than you have, but it doesn't mean I'm any better at it than you are. And so the letters are deliberately framed as being teaching, as being encouraging, as being exploratory, as offering explanations, and they're all grounded around really concrete day-to-day life stuff. It's not abstract. Lots of examples of day-to-day life. There's a brilliant letter in which Seneca writes about, "I was an idiot. I know I get seasick. I shouldn't have got on that boat around the Bay of Baiae. And what did I do? I went on that boat around the Bay of Baiae. And then I got to the shore and I was very, very ill. And that made me think about the state of our souls." And then continues for another 17 sections. I'm doing a bad summary of it, but you get these really human experiences that then launch you into philosophical reflection, in a really relatable way, which is what these letters were meant to do. It was meant to they're written to make philosophy accessible and understandable to people who are not necessarily interested in sitting and reading through, 7 books of On Benefits, for instance, or whatever else it might be. They're meant to be bite-sized, digestible, provoking. And I say provoking in a good way because they're meant to make you think. They're meant to make you chew over whatever you've been given.
Well, and they're very good at that. And I think it's letter 123, although as we discussed before we started, I misnumbered some things in my outline for today. But on my copy, it's page 231. No man's good by accident. Virtue has to be learnt. I mean, there's a lot of things in here like that that you can really boil down to a sentence. But I have frequently bought copies of this and Marcus Aurelius's Meditations and sent it to people who were going through tough times because I do think it's very helpful. And particularly, and we can talk about, I'll go a little bit out of order, where he talks about, I think it's in letter 91, about death and having to understand what awaits us and make our peace with what's going to occur. Could you talk a little bit about his philosophical approach to death and inevitability and those sorts of things?
Yeah. So at this point, the Stoic view about death was first of all that all of the things that people said about there being an afterlife, some kind of hell, was not in fact a thing. And that there were either two options. Either you would sort of go into sort of the Elysian field stuff and it would all be fine. Or you would go back into the state that you were before you were born. And you don't remember what it was like before you were born. So and you weren't unhappy or miserable or sad. So why would you be unhappy or sad about being dead? Um, and sort of thus managed to sort of focus on sort of the fear about the actual moment of death itself as opposed to sort of the afterlife, as it were. Um, his in part his attitude to death is really informed by a couple of things. There's his understanding of the Stoic theory of indifference. So if something is an indifferent, it basically means it isn't virtue. The only thing in life that you should be striving for is virtue. That is the thing to aim for. Everything else is an indifferent. So that means health, money, political influence, all of these things, they're indifferent, right? The only thing that will make you happy in Stoicism is virtue, behaving virtuously. That is it.
Right. People who have the money and the political connections can say that easily, but we could talk about that later.
Yes, yeah,
I'm not saying
yeah.
that it's wrong. I'm just pointing that out.
Oh, absolutely, yes. It's not an unreasonable an unreasonable critique. But you have that position. But it then sort of says, look, and one of those things that's an indifferent is being alive, right? It might be what they call a preferred indifferent, given the choice with nothing else in the picture, being alive, being not alive. Right, you prefer to be alive or balance, just like given the choice between being wealthy and being poor, if there's nothing else in the balance, you prefer to be wealthy, right? So there are preferred indifference, but ultimately there will be scenarios in which um, actually that's not worth it. So one of the examples he gives sort of the situation where he was contemplating dying by suicide because his health was so poor. And he kept on having really bad attacks of catarrh, and he was really ill, and he was really miserable. And essentially, it's the quality of life argument. He just felt it was so bad that he did not actually want to continue living. And then he reflected on it, and he reflected that actually that was not going to be worth the misery it would inflict on his family and people who would care about him and his father. And so he decided to stick it out, and thankfully things improved. But those kinds of questions about, it's an indifferent, is it worth keeping at the extent of, for instance, compromising your moral integrity, that kind of thing. So that's part of what informs his idea of his attitudes around death, is sort of seeing life not something you should cling to under any circumstances to compromise your virtue. By virtue, I mean virtuous action. If you are given a choice to do a thing or to die, it depends what the thing is. If the thing is going to completely corrupt your moral state, your moral integrity, then there we are. And the Stoics generally come up with all sorts of hypothetical situations to illustrate this. Um, that's one part of it. The other part of it is he thinks about fate. He thinks about the idea of fate as, the Stoics think that this is the best of all possible worlds. I appreciate I'm saying that on a Thursday. But they think
Yeah, I
about
mean, I have some comments, but I'll save them.
well, you know what? If this is the best of all possible worlds, you just think about the alternatives and have the quiet moment of internal screaming. But according to the Stoic pattern, everything has been set in motion by a providential divine force. Everything happens in the best possible way. It's been arranged to happen in the best possible way, and as part of that, human lives end. And so because everything has been fated, because everything is together in order, then it is fated that at some point your life will end. It's in the order, it will happen at in the best possible sort of circumstances, which admittedly might be pretty awful, but again, there is a providential ordering to the world which goes beyond just you yourself. But because there's that fate, and because there is that fated order to things, and because fate means that circumstances change. So 1 minute, I think the example in letter 91 is the city that burns down, isn't it?
Right.
And 1 minute it's there, and 1 minute it's ashes. Oh, good grief! Yes, we're saying that in the California wildfires week as well, which unfortunately is a very vivid illustration of exactly the same principle. That you can go from being in a situation of everything being absolutely wonderful to being in a situation where it really isn't. And actually, there is being prepared for the fact that these things will happen, and that these changes will occur, and being prepared to respond to them is a much better place to be for the Stoic emotionally and morally, than to pretend it's not going to happen. So it's about saying, look, we know these things are going to happen. It's not that we don't take them seriously, and it's not we don't find them. It's not that we don't say they're bad things. Absolutely, in this case, I think it's the city of Reims burning down is a bad thing. But it's about saying there was always the possibility this was going to happen. and it's happened. So how do we respond to that in the best possible way? Similarly with human life, it's like, well, you know you're going to pass away at some point. All other humans have before you.
Spoiler.
Exactly. So being clear-eyed and honest about that possibility, both for yourself and for those people you love, actually gives you the possibility to prepare better for when it happens, rather than behave as if this is a total shocker and we didn't see this coming, and be, uh, yes, that's a turn of phrase, be kneecapped by grief. It's not that you don't feel the grief when it happens.
Right.
It's not that you're expected to be this unemotional, feelingless thing, but it's sort of being very honest about the fact that these changes, that fate has these things in it, and these changes happen. And in the case of death, some of them are more predictable than others.
Right, and that's part of where, going back to the Stoicism and the practice of law, my 2022 through 2023 was crazy, and that's part of where this idea came from. But we'll save that for another time. But to your point, there were a couple of things. The not compromising the integrity, Zuckerberg, was one thing that came to mind. But also, I had when the new administration was going to take over in the United States, that's kind of what was coming back to my mind. What was in Letter 91, nothing is durable, whether for an individual or for a society. The destinies of men and cities alike sweep onwards. What is quite unlooked for is more crushing in its effect, and unexpectedness adds to the weight of a disaster. And so what I've been trying just to do in my mind as someone who politically doesn't agree with that administration on a lot of things, although apparently they're trying to get rid of the penny, which I think would be great. But hey, it was an election. It happened. We know these things can happen. We've got 4 years, and we just have to kind of get through it. And that's been my approach, as opposed to getting mad about everything, like I think a lot of us did from 2016 until Joe Biden became president. But I had a question about your mention of providential ordering. Does
Yeah.
providence in that mean good?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
because
So
can I
yeah,
ask a
yeah.
question about that?
Yeah, sure.
If that's true, how do you explain Ted Cruz?
I try not to.
Okay.
Um, I think the idea that's sort of sitting there is that even though, the whole point is that there is kind of a divine thing, a divine force called the pneuma, the divine world soul, some people translate it as, although that's a bit sketchy, that sort of infuses everything. And it's actually part of what makes us humans human in the Stoic idea, is that we're rational because we have some of this pneuma, this divine force in us, and that allows us to be rational. And when we're being rational, when we're being fully rational, haha. Oh, that's how we explain this. There we are. When we're being fully rational, we are then able to make fully rational choices. We're able to see what virtue is. We're able to make those virtuous choices and to behave virtuously. Okay? Now, Seneca and the Stoics are by no means saying that everyone in the world is doing this. There are plenty of people there who've got this divine spark in them, who've got this spark of rationality in them, who aren't using it. To come back to the indifference, they're people who haven't realized that pursuing political power, pursuing wealth, pursuing personal advantage, pursuing influence, whatever else you might have, pursuing, I don't know, the latest pair of sneakers, right? Whatever it might be, haven't realized that these things are not going to make them happy, but they place indifference as the thing that's going to make them happy and then pursue them. So when we're thinking about people who perhaps have focused on certain things to bring them happiness that are not in fact virtue, the Stoics would say, well, they haven't actually engaged that rationality. They've not developed their rationality in order to be able to realize that these indifferents they're pursuing are not actually going to make them happy. And they are then going to carry on being miserable because they have misperceived understandings about how the world works. And clearly what they need to sort them out is a good course of Stoicism, because then they will be able to realize what they should be doing to engage their rational faculties, will sort out all these mistaken beliefs, and they will be able to act rationally, which means they'll act virtuously, which means they will choose the good.
You were talking a little bit about pursuit of things, and that kind of ties back
Mm.
to Seneca's comments on wealth and not wanting too much and not getting consumed by things. And I don't mean this to be critical, but I always associate those kind of comments, and I'm not saying that they're wrong philosophically. I think that they're right about finding the balance, because that's essentially how I view all this stoicism is just finding the balance in life. But I find it interesting because that commentary comes a lot of times from people who already have everything, so they don't have to worry about it. And at work as an attorney, I'm always in my mind like, it's been a while since I've talked to a potential new client. When is my phone going to ring?
Yeah,
When am I going to
yeah.
have? And I think that's more a reflection, perhaps, of where I grew up and the economic situation at which we grew up. But I still think, though, even though the messenger may not be right, that there is a lot of importance there, a lot of good wisdom to be imported. Could you talk a little bit about what he was conveying?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of go to your point about this being terribly convenient for people who are very comfortable to be able to say, this is a critique that's leveled at these guys all the time, because, and that is partly, it's partly sort of a reasonable critique, and it's partly because the evidence that we have mainly comes from, what a surprise, wealthy, elite, guys, and it is guys, whose writings happen to have survived. Yeah. And that of course gives us a very narrow snapshot of who who thought Stoicism would work for them, and who thought Stoicism would function for them. And it's very easy then to sort of go, well, obviously this is the philosophy for the comfortable elite to make themselves feel better. Um, but I think there are two things that kind of make me feel maybe a bit more positive about Stoicism rather than just that. The first of which is, in the letters, Seneca does talk about, he talks about, in a slightly awkward Marie Antoinette kind of way, practicing what happens when hardship happens to you. So, as a rich man, you should go and have some days in which you're living on, you're staying in small rooms, you're staying on a rubbish mattress, you're eating just bread and water, you're really sort of changing your lifestyle so that when those changes happen, you're prepared for them. And he explicitly said in that letter, now, no, you've got to do it properly. You can't do it like these poor rooms, quote air quotes, that some people have as kind of like a novelty or a holiday. It's basically saying you can't have Marie Antoinette's shepherdess cottage. If you're going to do this, you've got to do it properly. And so I think there is at least some awareness of him there, that yes, I happen to be really comfortable right now, but it does only take that nudge and I'm back down at the bottom of the wheel of fortune. It only takes the nudge. So I think there's a seriousness there to realizing that people who have this philosophical position could find themselves overturned, as indeed Seneca does when we come to the end of his life.
But
The
I
other
do.
person,
Oh, I just want to say that the
yeah,
criticism,
yeah,
though, about, hey, it's these people who are saying this, it
yeah, yeah.
doesn't mean, though, that their advice and suggestions
Oh
are any
no.
less valid. Because, I mean, that in letter 8, what you have to understand is that thatch makes a person just as good a roof as gold does. That comment about that we're trying to import to our kids about living below your means and not spending too much. I mean,
Mm.
that's very wise and pertinent information.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that the Stoics took this seriously is evidenced by the other guy I was going to mention, who is called Epictetus, who is a Roman Stoic who's a little bit later than Seneca, and we have a selection of his discourses. He used to be enslaved. He was a freedman, which is what the Romans called for slaves who had been emancipated. So he had been enslaved, and he experienced the violence that was inflicted upon enslaved people in ancient Rome. And for whatever reason, he ended up being a really well respected Stoic teacher. And so, even though he had come through that experience of enslavement, he still found that there was something in Stoicism for him, to make it worth his while to try and teach probably upper class teenagers who were on their gap years. To get his lecture notes are clearly written at the 18 to 25 set. They're hilarious in some ways. But he has found that philosophy has something to say to him, despite coming from the exact opposite end of the spectrum that Seneca came from. So I take a little bit of heart in, that this was not just sort of a comfort thing for the wealthy elite.
Yeah,
Um,
and I've got that book, and I'm looking forward to reading that. Actually, it'll kind of complete my philosophical trilogy, initial
mhm.
trilogy. We'll see about prequels and sequels later.
No,
But
he's great fun, is Epictetus. He's let's put it this way, there's a certain not suffering fools gladly that makes it very clear that he's very familiar with sort of late teenage, early 20s men. It's very, as a university lecturer, I have a lot of sympathy with the sorts of things that Epictetus gets recorded as saying. Um,
um, that given the incident I had with my son and his friends lately, that really speaks to me. But I won't go into that. So, what else could you tell us about Seneca? I mean, he's written a lot more than these letters, and
yeah.
you in fact have a project in the works. Could you tell us about that?
I do, yeah. So I'm currently on sabbatical, which is sort of 3 months off to basically be able to think. And so, as well as writing all of this philosophy, Seneca also wrote tragic plays, and he is the only Roman author we have who has complete tragic plays. We've got fragments and bits, but he is the only person we've got a whole Roman tragic play from. And what I did in a previous book was I looked at all of the philosophy to find out what Seneca was doing with the family. And now I am in the process of putting together a book in which I find out what he said about the family in his drama using that philosophical framework. And my basic idea is that Seneca, well, first of all, the first book was saying, oh, look, Seneca has a philosophy of the family, which sounds like really obvious, but nobody had said it. And the this book is kind of saying, look, okay, so there is a philosophy of family, but what Seneca does in his tragedies is he sets up a world that works like a Stoic world should, so it works according to Stoic rules. And then he tests some of these axioms to destruction, which you can do with Greek myth characters because they are all basically absolutely chaotic and gently on fire. So it's a really good place to see what happens when the family stuff doesn't work, when it goes horribly wrong. Whereas in the philosophies, of course, it all works out properly, and this is how it's supposed to function, and this is idealized, and this is all very neat. Whereas in the tragedies, it really, really isn't. So that's what I'm thinking about at the moment.
Well, that's great, and we'll be looking forward to that. I actually have not. The only thing I've read of Seneca's is his letters, so I guess I have some more reading material now to put on the list. Um, so he wrote plays, he wrote these letters, he wrote things about how
Yeah.
to run a proper, to go back to my history class, graft system. What other topics did he delve into?
So he did lots and lots on moral philosophy. So he has a big book on anger, a big text on anger, 3 books. He has various things on it. I mean, essentially a group of small collected texts on how to live a good life, essentially. How to make good choices in difficult situations, about on the shortness of life and on leisure, how to live with otium, which basically means how to do your philosophy properly. And what else? What else? What else? He also wrote 3 consolation texts, which are we think his earliest philosophical output, which are a text written as well, consolations, which is a kind of writing you did in the ancient world, which sort of something awful has happened to somebody, and you write a lengthy, you know, mini treatise to them to attempt to philosophically console them for what's gone wrong. And he writes 2 to women whose, well, no, writes 1 to a woman whose son has died. But died several years ago, and she's kind of not got past the first stage of grief. And so that's sort of trying to encourage her to not to drop it and move on, but to kind of sort of move through that mourning process and sort of carry on with her life rather than get stuck in this place. He writes one to one of Claudius's freedmen whose brother has died, and consoling him for his brother's loss. And right at the end, it also becomes a, and by the way, can I be recalled from exile now? Right at the end, which playing the system a bit. And then the third one, he actually writes to his own mother. And it's really interesting because it's a consolation to his mother about the fact that he has been sent into exile. So he is consoling her about the misfortune of losing him. And that's not what these are normally like.
That's a
Um,
take. That's a take.
but it's also quite he takes it seriously because he's like, no, okay, so let's just take exile. And people think that exile is a really bad thing, but let's go through the philosophical reasons for not thinking that exile's a bad thing. And it's not kind of like, oh no, you'll be fine without me, but I'm that kind of thing. It's sort of a it's also a really affectionate thing because he does write to her and say, well, but I know that you're going to find it difficult to get to this stuff. And you need to sort of put some time aside. And I'm really sorry that my dad didn't let you do more philosophy. He actually says that in the consolation. Because if he'd let you do more philosophy, you'd be in a better position now. But while you're doing that, don't forget you've got my brothers and you've got your great niece, you've got your great nephew, and you've got your great niece, and surround yourself with their love and support, and it'll all be all right. And so you've got this combination of like really theoretical philosophical thinking with essentially family care and support, and it's an extraordinary text. It really is.
Well, we have a lot of good stuff to read now, if we want more than just the letters. So let's get to the closing topics here on the podcast. Where can we find you on the socials?
Okay, so I am on Blue Sky as Liz Gloyn. That's kind of my main space of occupation at the moment. I also have a blog which is called Classically Inclined. So if you search for me, you will find me. There aren't any very many false positives.
All right. And give us a good book to read. It can be from antiquity, from any book at all.
Actually, do you know what? I'm going to go possibly not expected for the last book that made me laugh hysterically and also cry, which is Olivia Waite's Love at First Spite, which is a rom-com romance kind of number um, about a woman who ends up moving into the tiny Spite house in the house which is a sort of like a 10 feet wide tiny house built in a gap between two other houses. They explain it in the book better. Next to the fiance who dumped her, and opposite the brother who made the fiance dump her, and how you end up having an unexpected romance. And it made me laugh, it made me cry. It was an absolute delight, and I can thoroughly recommend it. But yes, it is in the romance category, so might not. Oh, and the other thing I should say that she's also done is she's done a book called Spoiler Alert, which, believe it or not, lies very deeply on Aeneid fan fiction.
Huh.
Which I enjoy teaching when I do contemporary approaches because it's far more fun than it should be.
I am I've learned a lot during this podcast, but learning about the term spite house, just fantastic. There's a whole Wikipedia entry. A building constructed or substantially modified to irritate neighbors or any party with land stakes. Oh my gosh, I love this. This is amazing.
People are
Wonderful.
petty.
I know.
People are petty with architecture.
My wife is gonna love this part of the podcast. Oh man. Um, well, she's a redhead, so spite is in her nature, genetic. She can't get past it. And actually, we had a discussion about you talked about the Aeneid fanfic. I've had this theory that Dido uh, has redhead energy in her existence. Maybe a
Uh,
grandmother, something. I mean, the only way you go out like Dido did is if you have that redhead energy. So if you know, you know. Um,
mhm.
but give us a future podcast topic here for the podcast. I'm not promising it will happen, but I will try.
And again, I've frozen. One thing to think about.
I mean, spite houses alone. What else do we need? Jeez, this is
Unfortunately, less
amazing.
unfortunately less good for um actually, although if we're thinking space, no, I've frozen. I will think of something and I will say it in a reasonable way. Actually, do you know what? You could easily go and play with Epictetus, somebody who will work on Epictetus for an hour, because that I think I would say that Epictetus himself would be he's less known than Marcus Aurelius and than Seneca, partly because his writing is not less accessible, but there are four books of it, and he's kind of fallen. He's of the trio, he's the one who gets less shine. But I think he's got some super exciting and interesting things to say. And yeah, he's great fun.
Well, excellent. That's a great topic, and I am definitely going to look into it. And I have that book. It's been on my shelf for a while, so I'm going to
Mm.
have to get to it here soon. Well, thank you, Dr. Gloyn, so much for coming on. This was a fascinating topic. I learned a great deal more about Seneca, well beyond the little that I had already known about him. And thank you for educating me and hopefully the rest of our audience. Now, everybody knows where to find the Classical Antiquity Sidequest on social media. It is either at AntiquityPod or at Duke FB Coverage. Check us out at our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. Check out the YouTube channel. That's where the primary focus is. Hope you enjoyed the music on the way in, and I hope that you enjoy it on the way out. The music was specially made for this podcast by Brent Arehart. We have other episodes that we'll post in the coming months, and they will continue to post in the coming months because I can't stop doing this. Because as you all know, Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.